And Good Daily Podcast. My name is Daniel Dietrich. I am your host, your producer, and your friend. Glad to be with you this day. It is a Thursday, which we talk about issues. Doug is on location today in Washington, DC, where he's participating in a march and talking with some of our partners there in DC. One of those partners is Bishop Mariann Budde. Bishop Mariann Budde is Bishop of the Diocese of Washington DC. That's the National Cathedral, if you're familiar with that iconic church. It's one of her churches is also a site of this infamous photo where Trump used tear gas on American citizens to clear a churchyard so that he could hold up a Bible in front of a church, St. John's Church there. Bishop Mariann Budde had to respond to that, saying this is antithetical to the teachings of the church, everything we believe. So we're going to get into that day, that story with Bishop Mariann Budde in just a little bit in the interview. And I hope you enjoy it. This is Doug Pagitt with Bishop Mariann Budde. Here you go.
All right. Hello.
Hi.
Thank you for letting me be in your home.
My pleasure, always.
Let's start with what is a bishop? You're the bishop of the Washington Diocese of the Episcopal Church.
I am.
For those who are not in a system that has a bishop, what does a bishop do? And why is that? What I've been thrilled with in learning from you is the function of that, like in people's lives, why they want to have a bishop.
Right.
Like, I want to have a bishop. You're my bishop. I don't even know why I want to have a bishop. I'm really interested in why that is. So what does a bishop do and how does it?
Right. Thanks for asking and thanks for coming. So a bishop is...
Hello, Paul.
Hope I'm not photobombing right
The bishop's husband. That's
Just
okay.
just talking.
Yeah.
So in our church, the Episcopal Church is divided up into jurisdictions that are called dioceses, like the Catholic Church. Diocese is a geographic area, and a bishop has responsibility to secure or to ensure the spiritual well-being and the institutional viability of the congregations in that diocese. And so in the Diocese of Washington, which was carved out of the Diocese of Maryland in the late 1890s, consists of the congregations in the District of Columbia and about half of the state of Maryland, 4 counties in Maryland. And it's a bit like the solar system. You need planets to have a solar system, but once you have the solar system, the system itself has a life. And so you need congregations to make up a diocese, and they were established a long time ago. But now that it exists, the bishop has a role of ensuring that there is cohesion and some, as I said, health, viability, spiritual direction and guidance. Most of my influence is influential, however, and not, I don't have a lot of explicit authority to tell congregations or priests what to do. So it's not as heavy-handed a role, because our congregations are also fiercely independent, both by temperament and by the way our church is structured.
And you say not as heavy-handed on the continuum of other.
Well, I can't. For example, I can't move clergy. The congregations hire.
Like the Methodists.
We don't.
If you're Methodist, you have a bishop.
You have a bishop or a district and superintendent that can actually move you. I cannot do that unless the congregation is in some crisis. I cannot, in our diocese, I cannot demand that congregations pay into the diocese to support the ministry. That's a voluntary giving process. I can't tell congregations what to do, but I can influence by relationship and spiritual presence, and then having enough collective discernment about what our common path is. Now, I don't want to understate it either. I do have significant influence over who gets ordained. I can intervene in places when there's a crisis. And so a great example is the pandemic, because I made the decision at a pivotal point that we were going to close public worship, right? And I basically said that to the diocese. The interesting thing to me was that nobody said no, right? But on some level, I think they if they had wanted to, they could have pressed the point, right?
Yeah.
Like we would have gotten into a big argument about that,
Yeah.
and but they didn't, because on some level they were grateful, even if they were irritated. They were grateful that someone at that moment was taking the helm. And then all the way through, I tried to, with a team, of course, tried to lead them through various processes. And I was really grateful that they abided by that.
So some of it's managerial, or
Very-
leadership,
right,
or organizational.
Lots of administrative work,
Lots of-
lots of triage, crisis work. And more recently, it's taken me a long time to figure this out. I've been at this now for almost a decade, and I would say the last 4 years has been more strategic planning, leadership, goal setting, in a much more explicit and intentional way. Because the Episcopal Church needs to adapt. Because we're in as all mainline churches are, we're in a pretty significant adaptive moment in terms of how to make a translation from a staid, traditional expression of Christianity into a period of history when that's not necessarily the felt need of a lot of people, and that's not, and spiritual resources are kind of all over the marketplace and all over, you can get your spiritual needs met in so many different ways. And so what's the particular path that a liturgical, sacramental, in many ways traditional Christian expression, how does that work?
So one part of your role is managerial.
Right.
You have congregations, you're upper management in the system, but there's also a spiritual function.
I was going to say that there's another part which is both inspirational. Like I feel it's my responsibility to place before the people that I serve a compelling and invitational understanding of what it means to be a follower of Jesus, practicing Christian in this day and age, and food for people, real spiritual food, and providing resources for them. And then also I'm, from time to time, in Washington, it's a slightly amplified platform because of the location and the role of the National Cathedral, but also from time to time being called on to speak on behalf of, or to step into public spaces where there is a need for a Christian presence on a level of leadership that speaks with some authority, and with some sometimes prophetic but often pastoral responses to the issues of the day.
Yeah, we live in this strange period or strange reality where we all want agency. People don't want someone else telling us how our faith ought to be, how our lives ought to be. But then we kind of want people to be experts or in charge or to know something, right?
Or guidance, I think there is, but it's a balancing act, and I think it is earned authority more than institutional authority. There is, I often felt in the beginning that I was elected to this post, so I was given by virtue of my election all of this authority in that sort of ephemeral way, but I also had to earn it, and that it's possible. And I've learned this too, it's possible to spend years earning trust, and it doesn't take very much to lose it, right? You can really make a mistake that can set you back a ways. So I've learned that. I've learned that I have to be pretty transparent and human. I have to acknowledge mistakes when I make them. I have to allow others to do the same. I have to create a team and a culture, so it's not all on my shoulders alone, but an environment that people can trust. Yeah, it's a big job.
And you have the function of being the bishop to the churches and the people in the Episcopal communion here. But you also have a public role.
I do.
That's broader than, and every bishop does.
Every bishop does, right.
They're the representative of this group of people to the rest of the world. And a lot of people feel this in their work, that they have their own organization they work with, internal organization, but then they know that they're also connected to some larger group. And knowing which role you're in sometimes, I would imagine that really feels different, that there's the daily work of caring for the diocese, and then there's maybe it's daily work as well, or at least the occasional work of being this public voice.
Right.
That, especially for you in Washington DC, people want to have you commenting on issues that seem to impact the rest of the country,
right,
in a way that some other places don't. How do you personally navigate those roles? Like when you're feeling like you're the bishop to the communion, and when you're the representative of a whole faith tradition, and for a lot of people a real position of national attention. How do you do that?
Well, navigate is a good verb because it indicates that you're on a choppy sea, right, or a very calm one sometimes. I mean, you have to judge the waters and the wind and the surroundings. I would say that when I first came, I was very clear that I could be the chaplain to the nation or the chaplain to the political class as a full-time job if that's what I wanted to do. And I knew that wasn't my job, because if I did that, I could be a really cool public figure for, a run, right? But I would leave a weakened diocese as a result, and that my goal was to build up the church so that we were a credible witness, that we spoke. It wasn't just the bishop out there, but if the bishop doesn't have anybody behind her, or if she doesn't represent a thriving religious movement, what is the impact of her words, right? So I decided early on that I was going to keep that part of my role to a minimum, and I would always tie it back to the degree that I could to the stirrings or the sense of call that I sensed from within the diocese itself. And that was helpful because, for example, we are a really multicultural diocese, and we have a lot of immigrants in this diocese, many immigrants, both from West Africa, from the Caribbean islands, and increasingly since the 80s from Central America, given the number of people who came up during the Central American wars and settled here. I mean, the Washington DC area has more Salvadorans than any other place in the world except El Salvador.
Really?
It just became a place where people from El Salvador settled during those years. And so we have that in our diocese. And so when I speak on issues of immigration, it's not just a political issue, it's a pastoral issue, because we have people in our communities for whom that is their daily life, right? It was a little, it was a bit more of a leap, although I don't think a large one, when I decided early on that I would be a bishop that would show up consistently around gun violence prevention. And that was because the Sandy Hook killings took place within 2 months of my consecration. And it was also a moment in the country, which I'm sure you remember, it was just after Barack Obama had been reelected. And so there was a sense in the country that if we pushed now, we could bring some common sense legislation to an issue that both political parties had been ignoring for a decade because of the power of the gun lobbies. And we were wrong about that. The gun lobbies were much stronger than we were. But I decided that I wasn't going to step out of that space just because it was hard. And we've had enough, frankly, there's enough gun violence in our area to keep that alive. But do you hear what I'm saying? I'm taking issues that have a connection, and I'm as much a community organizer in spirit than I am I'm not afraid of being up front, and I'm called to that from time to time, but I know that our power is in the collective more than it is in my being a spokesperson in front of cameras. Right?
How do you navigate the call for individual personal spirituality in this modern era with the long tradition that your faith finds itself in? I mean, there's almost something in the sense that the Episcopal expression of faith is deeply rooted.
Right.
And yet we live in this time where there's so many other ways that people engage in their spirituality.
Right.
to bring a tradition fully into this moment and to live in both spaces. We joked a bit about this earlier today about how temperamentally we might be different. You have a stack of books sitting there next to you, and there's paper and there's artifacts, and you're in a system that uses all of the senses, a liturgical and a sensory faith, and yet we live in this world that's increasingly strangely global, kind of fractured, very digital, very screen based. Again, I guess it's a question of navigating, but how do you make that accessible on both ends for people who want their faith tradition to be rooted?
Right.
They don't want to give that up, but they also are living in, the 2021s.
That's the challenge of my life, actually, and I do come from a personal spirituality that is really eclectic, a spiritual background that is really eclectic. But like I think many people who wind up in our tradition or the Lutheran Church or the Catholic Church, that there is something about the ancient sacramental rhythms and sacramental practices that resonate deeply with us. And so while we may be anywhere on the spectrum of what we love and don't love about our tradition, there's something about those ancient practices and those ancient rituals that feel like they have contemporary relevance, not for everybody necessarily, but for us and for enough people that we feel called to keep that alive. And there are mythic connections too. I mean, the great story, the great arc of the story, Jesus as not only for those of us who follow him as a spiritual, as our spiritual anchor to God, as the human expression of God that connects us spiritually to God. He's a mythic person in the classic heroic sense that allows us to tell his story and to follow his teachings in a way that I think are really contemporary. And the frustration for me about the Episcopal Church is that we have this very generous theology and this expansive understanding of God and an ability to hold truths in tension, which is what kept me in the Episcopal Church and what I love about the Episcopal Church. So we have all of that, and because of that and because of the way we make decisions, we could move relatively quickly on some issues, right? On some inclusive issues, on some certain cultural realities that people needed to go first on, right? At some significant cost to us. And yet at the same time, we can be so mired down in the archaic governance and rigidness of our tradition that it can lose its power. So I sort of just juggle that all the time. But going back to there are a few people that you and I know and love that have been kind of anchors for me in this, and one of them is Brian McLaren, and he wrote a book a while ago, and I have it here, called Finding Our Way Again, which is a study of essential spiritual practices, right? And I actually didn't make it that much further beyond like the first chapter or two, because he talked about the value of spiritual practice as a way of helping us intentionally move into the space where we're met by the mystery of God, right? And that he talks about how important it is to become a person big enough to receive more and more of the mystery of God. And he actually says the kind of person you are determines how much of God you can experience, right? And so there's a call to kind of grow up, both spiritually and in every other way, so that more of God you can actually take in more of God, right? Yeah. And he also says, as many of the people here that I just grabbed when you said spiritual practice, many say that, it's part of the things about practice is you place yourself in ways that keep you open. You practice at the things both that you're not good at and the things that you have natural affinity for that you want to get better at. And as he says so beautifully, it kind of keeps you from going through life without becoming a jerk, right? Without being that person that nobody wants to be around because you've left untended the things in your life that make you a more full human being. And so for me, those practices, those rituals, those anchors, while I may not follow them perfectly, I never do, and I'm always starting over, the tradition and the practices, the sacramental calendar, they anchor me, and I think others who feel called to live through it and by it and through its stories in a way that give us a touchstone that is beyond or helps us make sense of all that's coming at us from every side.
Yeah, that is so interesting. This is a new thought for me, so maybe if when I get done with it, I won't like it as much as it feels like I do right now in my head. So often I've thought about practices, spirituality, and so on, sort of being a resource that we can utilize or not. Mm-hmm. Now that I'm not in the daily rhythm of being a pastor anymore, it's been very intriguing to feel or to pay attention to how easily talk of spirituality and spiritual practices can drift when you're not doing it as your work any longer.
Yeah.
Right? And what I've realized is maybe these spiritual practices are as much like, it's not as if I have an empty space.
Right.
It's something else is competing for that work and that allegiance.
Sure. Sure.
So in some ways, spiritual practices feel like, well, this is a better way to think about the world than this other way I could think about the world. Prayer or engagement or community or meditation. These are things that are like, yeah, I can do those instead of doing these other things. And I think for a lot of people, they've been told that, oh, spirituality is something I'm not really, I'm either into or not into. But I'm not sure it functions in a different space in our life. I think it's competing. This isn't coming out the way I want it to. It's kind of competing for the other allegiances. We were joking earlier. I could doom scroll through my Twitter feed all day, or I could take that same amount of time and do something that's going to sort of open me up and expand me to greater humanity.
Or it also could be the lens through which you look at your scroll, right?
That's it. Yeah,
so,
that's what I'm trying to say.
So it's so I don't think. Yeah, I think the saddest conversations I've had in my life are with people, or articles I've read, or about people who actually have come to a place where they don't think there is no spiritual realm at all, and there is no purpose at all. There's no call beyond the self. And I think it was Walter Brueggemann who said that's the greatest heresy of our time, that the notion that you can live an uncalled life, an unsummoned life, a life without a touchstone beyond just mere survival. Although for some, of course, survival is just daily struggle. And so there is this sense that there are spiritual experiences all the time. Yeah. But the question is, how do we integrate them? How do we make sense of them? What are the stories or the communities that can help us take a spiritual experience and go deeper with it, right? So it doesn't just become this thing that happened, but it's something that actually takes us to a place of greater depth and meaning, because there's no shortage of spiritual experiences. And they're all over the place, right? And because you said it's not like there's like our spiritual lives are over here and the rest of our lives are here. They're all together. And so maybe one of the most important spiritual practices is just to pay attention, just to find ways to be attentive to your life, and then try and discern how to respond. Yeah.
We have little grandkids in our lives, and you can see little humans when we're younger. When language starts to develop, the world starts to open. Oh my gosh. And it seems like that kind of keeps going, almost that you start discovering new languages, new concepts, ideas, and then you see the world a little wider, a little more colorful. You just have more connection to it, more engagement with it, and spirituality. I'm not sure it's as unique to the human experience as whatever non-spiritual things would be. Sure. But it's particular. It's a unique way of viewing the world.
And language is a big part of it, right? Metaphor, imagery. Yeah. consciousness, those things, and we don't know. I mean, I'm not a scientist or a botanist or a biologist or an anthropologist. I don't study all the other species of the planet, right? So I couldn't tell you. But what I know is that part of our humanity can be developed or it can be ignored, just like any other part. Which doesn't mean if I ignore it, it doesn't exist, but it does mean it's less available to me. And in some ways, as I was trying to say earlier, it's not that God is less present, but I'm less available to that power. And if I'm less available to it, obviously my capacity to respond and to be participant in it is compromised.
Only on a few occasions have I had the privilege of going through a museum or an art gallery with someone who really knows.
Who knows?
And when you're walking through that with people who know, and this would be true, I guess, of other places, maybe with a gym that someone would go to and
or
they've
an
never
orchestra,
been to.
and you're listening to a piece of music alongside somebody who knows.
And someone's like, let me describe what's happening here and why this is. Yeah. It comes alive. There's a sense in which our lives just sort of need that. We're going through our lives, and to have someone along who can say, here's something to notice, here's what's going on here, here's something you might want to tap into. That feels like the spiritual path that we're on. Right. We're finding that. That's what the traditions do, individuals do in our lives, writers, musicians. They're sort of narrating an additional way to see your life and to see your world. I know you're optimistic as a person. You're a very positive, optimistic, hopeful person. Are there things that you feel like we're really on the cusp of in either the Christian religion or the spirituality that we find ourselves in the world? Do you feel like we're in one of those catalytic moments, or do you feel like do you feel other things about that?
Yeah, boy, what a great question. The most honest answer is that I don't know for certain, and there are people who would argue one way or both sides of that continuum on any of the major issues of our day, issues of racial equity, issues of environmental crisis, issues of global consciousness. I would say if I had to choose how to live, I'm going to lean on to the side of hope, because I'd rather be on that side even if we fail than not, right? So there's a choice involved with hopefulness, right? But there are some pretty troubling realities that, like anyone, if I think about them too long, I can get pretty scared. So it's choosing to be hopeful, choosing to believe that yes, we are on the edge of things. Speaking of museums, several years ago I was in one of the museums here, and it talked about some of the great leaps that our species has made at particular moments. Real great leaps forward. And so you think, okay, we need to make some pretty big leaps in order for this species to survive. And we don't know if we're up for it, right? We don't know if we can do it. And you certainly feel that way as a nation. They were facing some really big things. And we have examples from our past where we have risen to that occasion, and many of our past where we haven't, and the consequences of both. And I've been really struck by the writings of Ibram Kendi when he talks about racism in this country and anti-racism, because he talks about them as kind of evolving in parallel. Like there is the evolution of racism and the evolution of anti-racism, and they are constantly next to each other, right? And he doesn't deny either one, but he's not. So he's like, there are times when he's very clear about the ways that racism has taken hold in this country, and also the ways that anti-racist thoughts have taken hold. And so, okay, like which side do you want to be on, right? Yeah. One of the reasons why I love our presiding bishop, Michael Curry, and his clarity of saying that the way of love that is at the heart of Jesus' ministry is at the heart of God. And so if you want to understand what God is up to in this world, you look for love and you try to embody love, not in a superficial or overly sentimental or romanticized way, but in the sacrificial love that we see in Jesus, right? So it's part of it is reclaiming Jesus from the caricatures of him that have been so distorting in our society and in the world, and following his teachings. Curry will often say, when people start talking about some of the, the more like race or like injustice, the further, even if they're people who profess to be Christians, they stop talking about Jesus.
Yeah.
Right? They don't quote him.
Right.
They don't, if you're talking about the border, if you're talking, they're not talking about Jesus anymore. They're talking about something else. And so, okay, well, what, so let's follow Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
And so, as a Christian, that's where I land.
And we're also living in this time where Christianity is needing to step back a bit, it seems to me, in the United States. Like, it's better if it's not... Christianity is a better faith when it's not in charge of...
What a way, it's a fascinating way of saying it, yeah. So I think we're at our best in the public square when we're focusing on issues for the common good, regardless of faith. When we're arguing for primacy of our faith in the public square, that's embarrassing,
Yes.
right? Like, we demand our ability to practice. So, I mean, yes, all people of faith and no faith have the right to practice or not practice, right? But to look toward what is love of neighbor, right?
Yeah, that idea that you would do nothing out of selfish ambition or self-conceit.
Does not insist on its own way, right?
Yeah.
It's not arrogant or boastful or rude, right?
I mean, it's really, the tradition and the early teachings of Christianity was trying to make it of service and blessing to the world, not of not of power and dominance. And yet, the issues of justice feel like they want us to raise our voices in a way that calls everyone to a better way, and that can feel a little bit like we're needing to be bossy, and a bossy faith of any kind feels off-put. So I think this is one of the tensions that we experience in this moment in our lives. To bring us back to the local space here, one of your roles, one of your churches, is right by the White House, and it became very famous for its location by Lafayette Square and Black Lives Matter Plaza, and became the backdrop for a president who cleared a crowd with the use of the military so he could hold up a Bible.
Right.
That was in front of the church that is in your care, and those are your people. Right. And to a lot of us, that became an icon, and we refer to it as an icon. But for you, that was people, and there's a congregation there. Can you just say a little bit about that contrast between, like, taking an issue, the way I will talk about Donald Trump standing in front of St. John's Church with a Bible up, strikes me as he shouldn't do that in front of a church. For you, you're like, hang on a minute, these are the people that I care about and are in my care. So it's more personal at that level, and more you're more integrated into that space.
Right.
That seems to be a better place to speak about those issues from that personal care, rather than someone like me who uses it as an illustration or an example without, I don't know a single person, the pastor, but like, it's not personal to me. It feels like it is to you. And I think that personal narrative is really powerful. Do you see it that way?
Absolutely. In that instance, however, while I was concerned about the people at St. John's, obviously, and we were working really hard in that moment, this was just days after, if it was the public outcry in Minneapolis was starting to spread across the country. People were gathering at Lafayette Square. We were trying to organize a pastoral presence for the protesters, right? Water and, masks and all. We were just trying to be present to that space. And then this atrocity happened. And I felt in that moment a responsibility for the witness and credibility of the Episcopal Church. Right, that he was taking, I felt it for something larger than that, right? The Bible, the sacramental, the authority that he was trying to claim, but the fact that it was happening outside of an Episcopal church. And I just knew that the sun could not go down without addressing that, because it was such an affront to the spiritual traditions that the former president, was tending to put as a mantle over his actions and his leadership. And I just knew that, I had to do it. There wasn't any, but I had to speak. I had to speak on behalf of all of us.
Yeah,
right?
It was your moment.
That was.
You were pulled into that.
I had to do that, and several people had said that to me. They, because people were just texting furiously. It was just going. But I just remember one of the people that I was just consulting really quickly. He said, we just need to hear from you right now. Mm-hmm. And then I thought, okay, how do all right, how do you do that? How do you how do you get in front of something, and it was, and this is the thing that I can never predict, because truth be told, I've made public statements before that the world has ignored, right? Nobody cares what the Bishop of Washington said on that day. Yeah. But that happened to hit a nerve at a moment. And so you show up for those. That's right. And I guess what I wanted to say earlier is that if I got seduced by those moments, I would look for them all the time, right? That would be my job. Yeah. But I can't do that.
Well, that's what I was sort of getting at, like the difference between illustrative moments that any of us can use for the thing we're trying to say, right, is really different than when it's in your house, when it's in your space, and you're not choosing that as a moment. Right. You were implicated. You were pulled in. Right.
And there would be times when you would want to be more proactive about that. So I want to say that. But no, I think you're right. And truth be told, not every Episcopalian was thrilled that I did that. Right. We have a broad spectrum of thought, and I received, and not just from the Episcopal Church, but from the country. It was running about 50-50 for a while in terms of how, what people thought I had done. Within the diocese, however, and I monitored that far more closely than I did, in terms of my response to people, it was overwhelmingly a response of gratitude. And I still get it today. I was in church last Sunday and somebody came up and said, I just want to thank you for doing that, for speaking for us. And I thought, wow.
And it feels like that's the thing that I'm wanting to zoom in on here, is that for the people in the diocese, they also felt very connected.
It was personal. It was personal. And people showed up in droves all through the summer, all on Black Lives Matter Plaza. Bishop Barber was in town, and we had all kinds of things. And people just kept on coming and coming and coming. Yeah. And I think that's why they felt it. Yeah.
And it's a good reminder that every one of these iconic moments of crisis or of success is also someone's personal space in life, where how they operate their location. So you think of death or a murder or a struggle, and a lot of us can name those as moments, but they're also people's real lives that exist outside of what's known about that moment.
Well, you and I, are both from Minneapolis, and so when George Floyd was killed, it wasn't just the death of a black man by a white police officer. It was in our city. Yes. Right? I live here now, but I still have deep ties to that city. My son and his family now live in our house, and they were, there was just this sense of, oh my gosh, this happened in our city. Yes. And I think one of the things, you and I are both white people and people of privilege, and one of the things that this whole constellation of events has prompted in us, and certainly in me and in our churches, it's not just out there that these issues of systemic racism reside, but in here, both in us personally, in our institutions. Yes. Oh my gosh, the Episcopal Church, are you kidding me? Yeah. We sort of brought the justification of slavery with us over on the ships from England, right? So we are so embedded. And so part of our work now is, yes, to show up in those moments, but also to say, let's turn the mirror, let's do our own work, let's look at the inequities within our systems, as well as addressing the inequities in policing and all the other things.
Yeah, that it is personal.
It's really personal.
This stuff is personal.
So, Yeah.
Thank you, Bishop. My
Thank
Bishop.
you, friend. Good to be with you.
How does the Bishop of the Washington Diocese conclude things? Do you have a phrase? Do you have a thing you say?
It depends.
Do you have a regular?
I have a couple of blessings that I especially love, and one of them is actually a refrain from Teresa of Avila that, again, Brian McLaren kind of turned into a song, but I often use as a concluding blessing, which is basically to say that God has no hands and feet on earth but ours. No, ours are the hands with which he works, ours are the feet upon which he moves, are the eyes through which he sees. Ours are the lips through which God speaks. And so our call is to go forth into the world, inspired by that spirit, to look upon the world and to serve the world with kindness and with love. So I often say that.
That's awesome. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, man, that was a beautiful blessing. And I don't know about you, but I was encouraged by that whole conversation. I just really appreciate Bishop Mariann Budde's lack of cynicism. Like, I can get real bogged down real quick in how wrong everything is and how bleak everything looks and get real discouraged. And I just found that conversation really uplifting and encouraging. So if you appreciated that, you might appreciate the work we're doing this fall. We are doing a bike ride across the southern border. It's a long bike ride. It's going to take about 60 days. But we're trying to raise awareness for conditions at the border. We're meeting with partners along the way to talk about why people might be trying to cross the border, the conditions that cause them to flee their countries, and the conditions that greet them when they try to cross the border. And so I really encourage you to check out wethepeopleride.org. If you can't make it down to the border with us, people are putting together bike rides in their own communities all over the country. So I encourage you to get on that website and find ways to ride. Maybe you can put together a little ride, just a day-long ride in your neighborhood, in your community, in your town. Thank you to so many of you in the chat. Jim, thanks for your comments there. Bless you and thank you. Faith and nuance and deep encouragement. Thank you so much. But thanks to all for listening and being with us. And we'll see you tomorrow for a conversation about science. And then back on Monday for news. Tuesdays, politics. Faith Wednesdays. And just hope you have a common good day to you. See everybody.